Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty cool story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. So get cozy, enjoy it, and watch it till the end, guys.
There are moments in fiction that transcend the pages they're written on. Moments where justice feels so pure, so undeniable, that readers across the world find themselves cheering, fist-pumping, and experiencing genuine catharsis through words alone. In the vast, dark universe of Warhammer 40,000, where hope dies screaming and heroes turn to monsters, such moments are vanishingly rare. But when they do occur, they burn themselves into the collective memory of the fandom forever. This is the story of one such moment. A moment when one of the most despised characters in all of science fiction received exactly what he deserved. A moment when Kharn, the Bloody, who would later be known as Kharn, the Betrayer, delivered justice with his fists in a fighting pit aboard the World Eater's flagship Conqueror. This is the story of when Kharn fought Erebus and everyone cheered. To understand why this confrontation matters so profoundly, you need to grasp something fundamental about the Warhammer 40,000 setting. This is not a universe where good triumphs. The grimdark future of the 41st Millennium offers no clean victories, no happy endings, no simple resolutions to complex problems. The Imperium of man is a rotting corpse of an empire, sustained only by the suffering of billions. The forces of chaos represent corruption so fundamental that they twist reality itself. Humanity teeters on the brink of extinction, and has for 10,000 years. In such a setting, vindication feels like water in a desert. And Erebus represented something even more poisonous than the usual horrors of this universe. He wasn't just evil. He wasn't simply a warrior fighting for the wrong side. Erebus was the architect, the manipulator, the puppet master who orchestrated the single greatest catastrophe in human history and then smiled about it. He was, in the truest sense, the reason everything went wrong. And for books upon books, he suffered no meaningful consequences for his actions until he stepped into that fighting pit with Kharn. The scene unfolds in Aaron Dembski-Bowden's novel, Betrayer, the 24th book in the Horus Heresy series. The Horus Heresy itself chronicles the galaxy-spanning civil war that tore the Imperium apart, brother against brother, Space Marine Legion against Space Marine Legion, in a conflict so brutal it would reshape the entire galaxy forever. Betrayer focuses on the Shadow Crusade, a campaign of destruction led by two Primarchs who had fallen to chaos, Lorgar of the Wordbearers and Angron of the World Eaters. These two legions carved a bloody path through the realm of Ultramar, burning worlds and offering skulls to dark gods. But the real story, the human story buried within all that apocalyptic warfare, concerned relationships, friendships forged in the fires of a crusade, brotherhood that transcended gene seed and legion colors, and the breaking of those bonds through manipulation and murder. The fight between Kharn and Erebus wasn't just a brawl. It was the eruption of grief turned to rage, friendship turned to fury, and the kind of raw primal justice that the setting almost never permits. Before we dive into the fight itself, before we examine every punch and every moment that made readers want to stand up and cheer, we need to understand the players. We need to know who these men were, what they represented, and why one of them absolutely, positively deserved every single thing that was about to happen to him. The architect of all betrayals, understanding Erebus. If you were to ask any Warhammer 40,000 fan to name the single most hated character in the entire setting, one name would emerge above all others with the consistency of a religious chant. Erebus, first chaplain of the Wordbearers Legion, dark apostle of chaos undivided, the architect of the Horus Heresy itself, the man who, more than any other single individual, destroyed the dream of a united humanity and condemned the galaxy to 10,000 years of darkness and despair. But hatred this profound doesn't arise from simple villainy. Erebus isn't hated because he's powerful, though he is. He isn't hated because he's dangerous, though he absolutely is. Erebus is hated because of how he operates, his methods, his personality, the particular flavor of evil he represents, which manages to be both cosmic in scale and petty in execution. Let's start at the beginning, because even Erebus's origin story reveals the depths of his corruption. The boy who would become Erebus was born on Colchis, a world steeped in religious tradition. From his earliest days, he felt drawn to manipulation and deceit, not as tools of survival, but as expressions of his fundamental nature. He found joy in tormenting desert scorpions, in testing the limits of cruelty a child could inflict on helpless creatures. His parents scolded him constantly, comparing him unfavorably to another boy in their village, a studious, pious child named Erebus, who represented everything their troubled son was not. The solution this child found was as simple as it was horrifying. He strangled the other boy with a garrote, murdered him in cold blood, and then took his name and identity. He replicated the dead boy's facial tattoos and simply became him. This wasn't a crime of passion or desperation. It was calculated identity theft through murder, committed by a child who saw another person's life as something to be taken and worn like a mask. This Erebus, this stolen identity walking around in human skin, eventually joined the Covenant of Colchis as an aspirant priest. At first, he cared little for his studies, treating religious education as another game to manipulate. But gradually, something shifted. One day, staring into a cracked mirror that split his reflection into 4 distinct images, Erebus experienced what he would later call an epiphany. He realized that the dark gods, the powers that existed beyond the veil of reality, had been guiding him all along. Every manipulation, every cruelty, every act of deceit had been preparing him for his true calling. When Lorgar, the Primarch of the Word-Bearers, arrived on Colchis and toppled the Old Covenant, Erebus went into hiding. But he re-emerged as one of Lorgar's most devoted followers, quickly rising through the ranks to become the Legion's first chaplain. The Emperor himself arrived on Colchis to claim his son, and while everyone else fell to their knees before the majesty of the Master of Mankind, Erebus alone recognized what he called the anathema, the enemy of the gods he secretly worshipped. From that moment forward, Erebus dedicated himself to a single purpose: corrupting the Imperium from within. He whispered to Lorgar about the nature of divinity. He planted the seeds that would grow into the pilgrimage into the Eye of Terror. He orchestrated the events on Davin that corrupted Horus Lupercal himself, the War Master, the Emperor's favored son. Every step of the way, Erebus worked in shadows, manipulating events with a patience and cunning that bordered on supernatural. But here's what made Erebus truly despicable. What elevated him beyond simple villainy into the realm of characters that fans actively loathe. He did it all with such smug satisfaction. He viewed himself as Destiny's hand, the mortal instrument of the ruinous power's grand design. He genuinely believed he was the smartest person in every room, the master manipulator who saw 10 steps ahead while everyone else stumbled along in ignorance. And the worst part, for a very long time, he was right. Erebus orchestrated the Istvan III atrocity, where loyalist space marines were betrayed by their own brothers. He helped plan the drop site massacre at Istvan V, where 7 full space marine legions were nearly annihilated in a single day of treachery. He summoned the Ruin Storm, a warp phenomenon that cut the Imperium in half and allowed the traitors free rein to prosecute their war. He captured and brainwashed individuals to serve as sleeper agents. He manipulated Primarchs like pieces on a game board. Throughout all of this, Erebus suffered remarkably few consequences. When his plan to corrupt the Blood Angels Legion failed at Cygnus Prime, Horus Lupercal flayed the skin from his face in punishment, but the wound healed, albeit in a mutated and horrible fashion. When his manipulations became too obvious, he simply faded into the background, allowing others to take center stage while he continued pulling strings. He had an almost supernatural ability to avoid the full weight of his actions coming back to haunt him. But Erebus made mistakes too. Despite his cunning, despite his planning, he was ultimately a creature of arrogance. He believed his own propaganda about being destiny's hand. He thought himself untouchable, protected by the very gods he served. And this arrogance led him to underestimate the consequences of his most personal betrayal. During the Shadow Crusade, as the Word-Bearers and World-Eaters carved their bloody path through Ultramar, Erebus had a problem. His name was Argel Tal, and he represented everything Erebus could never be. Genuinely beloved, truly courageous, and capable of inspiring loyalty that transcended manipulation. Worse still, Argel Tal had formed a close friendship with Kharn of the World-Eaters, and that friendship was having an effect Erebus found intolerable. You see, Erebus had visions, glimpses of possible futures granted by his patron gods. In these visions, he saw Kharn's ultimate destiny as the betrayer, the chosen champion of Kharn, who would embody slaughter for 10,000 years. But he also saw something troubling. In many potential timelines, Argel Tal's friendship with Kharn prevented this destiny from manifesting. Argel Tal had a calming influence on the World-Eater. He could pull Kharn back from the edge when the butcher's nails threatened to consume him entirely. He represented humanity in a life increasingly defined by inhuman rage. This, Erebus decided, could not be permitted to continue. The future he had foreseen required Kharn to fall completely, to become the mindless engine of slaughter that would serve Kharn faithfully for millennia. Argel Tal's influence represented an obstacle to destiny itself, and obstacles were meant to be removed. What happened next would be the beginning of Erebus's downfall. Though he didn't realize it at the time, his manipulations had always targeted strangers, enemies, people he felt no connection to. But Argel Tal had been his student once. Erebus had inducted him into the Word-Bearers. There was history there, however twisted and one-sided. And Erebus was about to learn that some betrayals carry consequences even he couldn't talk his way out of. Kharn, before the fall, the captain who held the line. To understand why Kharn's fight with Erebus mattered so much, you need to know who Kharn was before he became the betrayer. Because the man who stepped into that fighting pit was not yet the mindless engine of slaughter that the 41st Millennium would know. He was something far more tragic, a warrior desperately trying to hold on to his humanity, even as it was being stripped away piece by agonizing piece. Kharn began his service as a line captain in the Warhounds Legion, back before they were reunited with their Primarch. Even then, he displayed the qualities that would define him: exceptional skill in close combat, an unshakable loyalty to his brothers, and a gift for leadership that transcended mere tactical acumen. But what truly set Kharn apart was his voice. Not his physical voice, though that was commanding enough, but his political voice, his ability to speak when others couldn't, to articulate truths that needed saying, to stand before authority and speak his mind even when doing so risked severe punishment. When the Warhounds finally found their Primarch, they discovered a broken demigod. Angron had been found on Nuceria, a world that practiced gladiatorial slavery on a massive scale. The young Primarch had been enslaved as a child, forced to fight in the pits for the amusement of the planetary nobility. Worse still, his captors had performed surgery on him, implanting devices called the Butcher's Nails deep into his brain. These archaeotech implants hijacked his neural pathways, replacing normal emotional responses with an overwhelming compulsion toward violence. They turned pain into rage, and rage into the only pleasure Angron could feel. The Emperor arrived to claim his son just as Angron was leading a slave rebellion, standing shoulder to shoulder with the only family he'd ever known against impossible odds. The High Riders of Nuceria had gathered armies to crush the rebellion, and Angron stood with his fellow gladiators, ready to die free rather than live in chains. Then the Emperor teleported him away. Just took him, leaving his companions to die without him while he materialized aboard an Imperial vessel light years away. The Warhound's Primarch arrived among them filled with volcanic rage, mourning losses that would never heal, cursing the father who had denied him the death he deserved alongside his brothers and sisters. And the Legion had no idea how to deal with this. Their Gene-sire was supposed to be their inspiration, their leader, their reason for being. Instead, they found themselves facing a damaged god who would kill them on sight simply for having the misfortune of being his sons. Legion Master Ibram Greer attempted to approach Angron and died for it. 6 more high-ranking officers met similar fates. The Primarch was killing anyone who came near him, drowning in an ocean of grief and rage that the Butcher's nails amplified beyond all reason. The Warhounds faced a genuine crisis. They had waited decades to meet their Primarch, had dreamed of the moment they would finally be complete, and now that moment had arrived in the form of a tragedy that threatened to tear them apart. This is when Kharn stepped forward. He was just a line captain then, no more significant than hundreds of others in the Legion. But he recognized that someone needed to act, and he possessed something most of his brothers lacked: the courage to risk his life for what mattered. Kharn walked into Angron's chambers, knowing he would probably die, and confronted the broken Primarch. What exactly transpired in that meeting has been lost to history, recorded only in fragments and half-remembered accounts. But what we know is this: Kharn emerged alive. Angron emerged changed. The murders stopped. The Primarch accepted his legion, though he would never love them as other Primarchs loved their sons. And the Warhounds became the World Eaters, renamed in honor of the slave gladiators Angron had fought beside and lost. Kharn rose rapidly through the ranks after that, becoming not just a captain of the 8th Assault Company, but Angron's equerry, a position that made him the Primarch's representative and voice. It was a role that required exceptional diplomatic skill, because Angron remained fundamentally damaged. The Butcher's nails were killing him slowly but surely, replacing parts of his brain with the implant's architecture, destroying his capacity for any emotion except rage. The Emperor's finest tech priests examined him and delivered a terrible verdict. Removing the nails would kill him. Leaving them in would kill him more slowly. There was no good option, only the choice between immediate death and prolonged agony. So Angron demanded that his sons receive the nails too. If he was cursed to live this way, if he was denied the death he deserved, then his legion would share his suffering. The early attempts at implantation had a 100% fatality rate. Space Marines, these transhuman warriors designed to be nearly unkillable, died on the operating tables as crude copies of Angron's nails scrambled their brains. But Angron wouldn't accept failure. He ordered the process to continue, even as the bodies piled up. Eventually, the apothecaries refined the procedure. Kharn was the first to survive. The first World Eater to successfully receive the nails and live to tell about it. He paid a terrible price for this distinction. The nails hijacked his brain chemistry just as they did Angron's, though to a lesser degree. They made pain into pleasure, violence into the only relief from mounting neural pressure. They ate away at his higher functions, making planning and strategy progressively more difficult, while making the act of killing progressively more euphoric. But here's the crucial thing: Kharn fought it. Even with the nails singing in his skull, even with every fiber of his being screaming for him to just give in and embrace the slaughter, Kharn retained his core self. He remained capable of friendship, of loyalty, of seeing his brothers as something more than obstacles or enemies. When the nails bit deep enough to send him into a berserker rage, he would later experience something like shame at his loss of control. He tried to be more than what the nails wanted him to be. This made him invaluable to the World Eaters. In a legion that was slowly losing its ability to function as a coherent military force, Kharn represented stability. He could think strategically, even when others could not. He could coordinate with other legions, even as his brothers grew increasingly unable to distinguish friend from foe. He mediated disputes, prevented needless bloodshed within the ranks, and generally served as the voice of reason in a legion that had precious little reason left. When Horus rose in rebellion against the emperor, the World Eaters followed him into damnation. This wasn't a choice born of ideology or grievance so much as simple pragmatism. The nails were pushing them toward a point where the Imperium would find them intolerable, where they would be censured or destroyed. Chaos, at least, offered acceptance of what they were becoming. The blood god, Kharn, welcomed berserkers with open arms and skull thrones. During the battles at Istvan 3 and 5, where the heresy erupted into open warfare, Kharn fought with distinction. He survived injuries that should have killed him, including being impaled on a land raider's dozer blade. His brothers recovered his broken body, and somehow, impossibly, he clung to life long enough to reach the apothecaries. Whether Kharn breathed life back into his lungs, or whether Kharn's own ferocious will refused to let him die, remains unclear. But he survived, and continued fighting. Then came the Shadow Crusade, and with it, Argel Tal. The Word-Bearers and World Eaters had been assigned to work together, striking at the Ultramarines' domain of Ultramar in a campaign of annihilation. This should have been a disaster. The World Eaters were barely controlled berserkers, while the Word-Bearers were zealots who mixed sorcery with warfare. The two legions had completely different approaches to battle, different philosophies, different gods they served. But against all odds, Kharn formed a genuine friendship with Argel Tal, the Crimson Lord of the Gal Vorbak. Argel Tal was an unusual figure in his own right, a possessed word-bearer who had willingly allowed a demon named Raum to share his body. But unlike most who made such bargains, Argel Tal retained his humanity and personality. He and his demon existed in a strange partnership rather than a simple possession, and somehow, perhaps because both men understood what it meant to share your soul with something inhuman, Kharn and Argel Tal understood each other. They became what the legions called honor brothers, a bond that transcended gene lineage and legion allegiance. They fought beside each other in the bloodiest campaigns of the heresy. They saved each other's lives more times than either could count. And crucially, Argel Tal could calm Kharn when the nails threatened to overwhelm him completely. He could reach through the red haze of mounting fury and bring his friend back to himself. He represented hope that Kharn might remain Kharn, rather than simply becoming another mindless killer in service to the blood god. This is the Kharn who would eventually step into that fighting pit to face Erebus. Not yet the betrayer, not yet the champion of Kharn who would fight for 10,000 years. He was simply a space marine captain who was watching his legion descend into madness, who was struggling to hold on to himself even as the implants in his skull tried to reduce him to pure violence, and who had just lost the best friend he'd ever had to the backstabbing machinations of a manipulator who viewed people as nothing more than pieces to be moved and removed. And unlike Erebus, unlike the word-bearer who thought himself so clever, Kharn understood something fundamental about the universe. Sometimes, the solution to a problem isn't manipulation or schemes or plans within plans. Sometimes, the solution is just to walk up to that problem and beat it to death with your fists. Two legions, one bloody purpose, the Shadow Crusade. To understand the context of Kharn and Erebus's confrontation, we need to explore the campaign that brought the Word-Bearers and World Eaters together, the Shadow Crusade.
You know, I've read through the Horus Heresy series multiple times, and I have to tell you, this scene hits differently every single time. There's something deeply satisfying about watching a character who spent 20 plus books manipulating everyone around him finally get what's coming to him. And it's not just me feeling this way. I've talked to dozens of fans at conventions, Discord servers, online forums, and like everyone has the same reaction. That moment when Kharn challenges Erebus, chills every single time. It's one of those rare instances in Warhammer where you're not cheering for the quote-unquote good guys. Because let's be honest, There aren't any, but you're absolutely cheering for justice. Sometimes that's enough. Anyways, let's get back to the story.
This was a massive military operation during the Horus Heresy, designed to keep Robute Guilliman and his Ultramarines occupied while Horus made his drive toward Terra. But calling it merely a military operation doesn't capture the sheer apocalyptic horror of what these two legions unleashed upon Ultramar. The World Eaters had been declining for decades before the Shadow Crusade began. The Butcher's nails, those horrific implants that hijacked their neural pathways, were taking an increasingly severe toll on the Legion's cohesion and capability. What had started as a surgical enhancement to create more aggressive warriors had metastasized into something far more destructive. The nails didn't just make the World Eaters more violent. They were slowly erasing everything that made them Space Marines, rather than simply berserkers. The implants worked by interfering with the brain's normal emotional processing, rerouting neural pathways to transform pain into pleasure and calm into anguish. A World Eater with the nails experienced constant, mounting pressure in his skull, a building tension that could only be released through violence. The longer they went without killing, the worse it became, until the pressure reached a point where rational thought became impossible and they lashed out at anything nearby just to make it stop. This created a vicious cycle that destroyed the Legion from within. Warriors needed to fight constantly to manage the nails' effects, which meant they sought out combat even when strategically unnecessary. This led to casualties that wouldn't have occurred if they'd been more patient or tactical. Those casualties meant the remaining warriors had to fight even harder to achieve objectives, which meant more exposure to the nails' influence, which led to more unnecessary violence, and on in a downward spiral that had no end except the Legion's complete dissolution. The World Eaters' command structure reflected this degradation. Where other legions maintained elaborate hierarchies and chains of command, the World Eaters had simplified theirs to the point of near collapse. Orders had to be simple and direct because complex strategic planning became increasingly difficult for warriors whose brains were being eaten away by implants. Coordinating with other Imperial forces was nearly impossible because World Eaters struggled to distinguish friend from foe once the nails achieved maximum intensity. Individual World Eaters developed coping mechanisms to manage the implant's effects. Some focused on ritualized behavior, creating personal routines that helped them maintain control. Others sought out specific kinds of combat that satisfied the nails without completely overwhelming their reasoning capacity. A few, like Kharn, developed the mental discipline to push through the neural pressure and maintain clarity even when the implants screamed for violence. But these individual solutions couldn't address the systemic problem. The World Eaters as a legion were dying, slowly but inexorably, their effectiveness declining with each passing year. By the time the heresy erupted, they were barely recognizable as the disciplined warhounds who had served the Emperor during the early Great Crusade. Where once they had been warriors who happened to be aggressive, now they were barely controlled killing machines who occasionally remembered their military training. The Shadow Crusade wasn't about conquest. The Word-bearers and World Eaters weren't trying to claim worlds for their own use or convert populations to their cause. This was annihilation warfare, pure and simple. Every world they touched burned. Every population center became a charnel house. Billions died, not because their deaths served any strategic purpose, but because the deaths themselves were the point. Blood for the blood god. Skulls for the skull throne. Words written in fire and agony across star systems that had known relative peace for generations. The operation began in the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Calth, where Kor Phaeron had led a surprise attack against the Ultramarines' primary fleet anchorage. That assault had been devastatingly effective, catching the Ultramarines completely off guard and inflicting casualties that would have crippled a lesser legion. But Kor Phaeron failed to kill Robute Guilliman himself, a mistake that would cost the traitors dearly. The Lord of Macragge survived, rallied his forces, and began hunting the word-bearers through the scattered star systems of Ultramar. This is where Lorgar and Angron's combined force became crucial. While Guilliman focused on recovering from the Calth disaster and reorganizing his legion, the Shadow Crusade smashed through dozens of worlds with terrifying speed. The word-bearers brought sorcery and the blessing of all four Chaos gods. The World Eaters brought unmatched ferocity and the kind of close-quarters brutality that turned battles into abattoirs. Together, they represented a force that even the mighty Ultramarines struggled to contain. But the relationship between these two legions was complicated, strained by fundamental differences in culture and purpose. The word-bearers fought with zealous fervor, viewing every battle as a religious observance, every death as an offering to their dark patrons. They carved unholy symbols into conquered cities, performed elaborate rituals, and took time to properly worship the powers they served. The World Eaters cared nothing for such niceties. They just wanted to kill. The Butcher's nails drove them toward violence with single-minded intensity, leaving no room for contemplation or ceremony. This created tension that threatened to tear the alliance apart. Angron, increasingly consumed by his implants and the pull of Kharn, would charge off to butcher strategically meaningless targets simply because the killing called to him. Lorgar would attempt to moderate his brother's behavior, to channel the World Eater's fury toward objectives that actually mattered. The result was a strange dance where neither Primarch quite got what they wanted, but the combination of their forces remained lethally effective. The common space marines of both legions navigated this tension in their own ways. Some World Eaters despised the word-bearers as sanctimonious zealots who wasted time with rituals when they could be killing. Some word-bearers viewed the World Eaters as mindless animals who had surrendered their humanity to crude implants. But others found common ground, united by shared service to chaos and the bonds forged in battle. Kharn and Argel Tal represented the best possibility of what this alliance could be. Their friendship demonstrated that World Eaters and Word-Bearers could work together, could understand each other, could forge bonds that transcended their legion's differences. Other pairs of warriors followed their example, forming partnerships across legion lines. The fighting pits on the Conqueror, where World Eaters traditionally worked out their aggression through ritualized combat, became a meeting ground where warriors from both legions could test themselves against each other. And that's where Erebus comes into this story once again. The first chaplain participated in these pit fights, not because he needed to prove anything, but because he enjoyed the status it gave him. He was skilled in single combat, having trained for decades as a chaplain where martial prowess was expected. He won his matches through a combination of genuine skill and subtle manipulation, knowing exactly which opponents to choose and how to exploit their weaknesses. Erebus cultivated an image of himself as a warrior priest, someone who balanced spiritual authority with physical capability. He wanted to be seen as more than just a schemer, more than simply the Legion's first chaplain. And for a time, this worked. World Eaters who fought him in the pits and lost did so without shame, acknowledging his skill. He earned a certain grudging respect, even from warriors who cared nothing for his religious fanaticism. But all of this was about to change. Because Erebus's manipulations were approaching a critical point, and he was about to commit an act of betrayal so personal, so cruel, that no amount of skill in the fighting pits would save him from the consequences. The Shadow Crusade carved its way through system after system, burning worlds and offering oceans of blood to the Chaos gods. The Ultramarines desperately tried to respond, but they were scattered, still recovering from Calth, and facing an enemy that didn't hold territory or maintain supply lines. Lorgar and Angron moved like a storm, striking and vanishing, leaving only ashes behind. Then came Nuceria, Angron's homeworld, the place where his tragedy had begun. Lorgar convinced his brother to return there, ostensibly to find some measure of closure, but really because the Golden Sun had other plans. He intended to use Angron's rage, amplified by the pain of returning to the site of his greatest loss, as the fuel for a transformation. Lorgar would turn his brother into a demon Primarch of Kharn, creating a weapon of unprecedented power. But this meant that every World Eater, including Kharn, was going to New Syria. They would fight on the soil that had broken their Primarch before he ever met them. They would see firsthand the High Riders who had enslaved and tortured Angron, and all the while, Erebus's plans were coming to fruition, his vision of Kharn's ultimate destiny approaching the moment of crystallization. All he needed to do was remove the obstacle standing in the way, remove Argel Tal, then everything else would follow naturally, inevitably, as destiny intended. He had no idea that some destinies come with consequences. Argel Tal, the last angel, and the bond of brotherhood. Of all the tragedies scattered throughout the Horus heresy, few cut as deeply as the story of Argel Tal, the Crimson Lord of the Gal Vorbak. His tale represents the best and worst of what the word-bearers could be. A warrior who retained his humanity even while sharing his body with a demon, who genuinely believed in something greater than himself, and whose loyalty to his friends proved stronger than his devotion to dark gods. Understanding Argel Tal is crucial to understanding why Kharn's rage against Erebus burned so hot it could have lit stars. Argel Tal's name meant the last angel in the dialect of the southern steppe tribes of Kolkis. He had been the youngest child in his family, born to simple parents in a village far from the centers of power. When Erebus inducted him into the Word-Bearers, the first chaplain initially groomed him to become a chaplain as well. But Argel Tal rejected that path, choosing instead to pursue his training among the fighting elements of the Legion. This decision brought the two into conflict early, and whatever relationship they once had soured long before the heresy began. When Lorgar ordered his pilgrimage into the Eye of Terror, seeking answers about the true nature of divinity after the Emperor's humiliating rebuke at Monarchia, Argel Tal was chosen as one of the select few to accompany the Primarch into that hellish realm. What they experienced there broke them all in different ways. Argel Tal and around 50 other word-bearers were exposed directly to the raw stuff of chaos, their bodies torn apart and reconstituted as vessels for demonic entities. The process wasn't gentle. Argel Tal described it later as being turned inside out, atomized down to the molecular level, twisted through dimensions that shouldn't exist, and then reassembled with a permanent passenger riding along in his soul. The demon that took up residence in him was named Raum, and it would be his constant companion for the rest of his existence. Most who underwent this transformation lost themselves entirely, becoming nothing more than meat puppets for their demonic occupants. Argel Tal somehow managed to maintain himself as the dominant personality, existing in a strange symbiosis with Raum. This made him the leader of the Gal Vorbak, the Blessed Sons, the first possessed Chaos Space Marines. In battle, he could release Raum fully, transforming into a towering demon creature of crimson flesh and bone, possessed of strength that matched even a Primarch. But he could also pull back, reasserting his human consciousness, maintaining the capacity for thought and feeling that separated him from mere monsters. This made him invaluable to Lorgar, who relied on Argel Tal as both weapon and counsel. But possession came with costs beyond the obvious. Argel Tal knew his death was coming. Raum had told him again and again that he would die in the shadow of great wings. The demon claimed this was prophecy, an unchangeable future that awaited regardless of what choices Argel Tal made. This knowledge colored everything the Crimson Lord did. He knew his time was limited, knew that some final battle awaited him, and he tried to make what time he had matter. During the Shadow Crusade, Argel Tal formed his unlikely friendship with Kharn. The two warriors bonded over shared experiences of hosting something inhuman within themselves. Kharn had his butcher's nails, Argel Tal had his demon. Both men understood what it meant to feel your humanity slipping away, to fight to retain yourself, even as something else tried to rewrite who you were. They became confidants in a way that transcended normal battlefield camaraderie. More importantly, Argel Tal served as a stabilizing influence on Kharn. When the nails bit deep and Kharn felt himself slipping into berserker fury, Argel Tal could reach him, could talk him down, could remind him that he was more than just a weapon, more than just an engine of slaughter. The World Eater trusted the Word-Bearer in a way he trusted almost no one else, and that trust was repaid with genuine friendship. They saved each other's lives repeatedly during the campaign. When Argel Tal's possessed form went wild, when Raum threatened to overwhelm him completely, Kharn would be there to pull him back. When Kharn lost himself to the Nail's bloodlust, Argel Tal would stand between him and friendly forces, preventing tragic mistakes. They fought as a pair, coordinating their attacks with the kind of synchronization that only comes from absolute trust and mutual understanding. Argel Tal also represented something increasingly rare in the traitor legions: genuine compassion. He rescued a woman named Cyrene from the burning ruins of Monarchia, the city the Ultramarines had destroyed at the Emperor's command. Cyrene had been a blessed of the city, a woman venerated for her devotion, and the Ultramarines' assault had blinded her. Argel Tal took her in, protected her, and eventually brought her aboard the Word-Bearer's flagship. Their relationship defied easy categorization, something between protector and friend, complicated by the fact that she represented everything the Word-Bearers had lost when Monarchia burned. When Cyrene died, killed by custodians hunting Lorgar, Argel Tal mourned her as deeply as any loss he'd suffered. He took up two weapons as remembrances: the Guardian Spear that had killed Zaphon, another of his close friends, and the Power Sword that slew Cyrene. He visited her tomb regularly, speaking to the woman who couldn't hear him, trying to process his grief in a universe that offered no clean resolution to such pain. Erebus watched all of this with growing concern, not because he cared about Argel Tal's emotional well-being, but because the Crimson Lord represented a threat to his plans. Erebus had visions of possible futures, glimpses granted by the chaos gods of timelines branching and recombining. In many of these visions, Argel Tal's influence prevented Kharn from fully embracing his destiny as the betrayer. The friendship between them represented a chain binding Kharn to humanity, and that chain needed to be severed. The irony would have been delicious if it weren't so tragic. Argel Tal, the possessed Word-Bearer who literally housed a demon in his body, was being targeted for destruction because he wasn't corrupt enough, because he retained too much humanity, too much capacity for friendship and loyalty, because he made Kharn better rather than worse. Erebus approached this problem with characteristic ruthlessness. He couldn't simply kill Argel Tal in open combat. The Crimson Lord was too skilled, too powerful, and too beloved by Lorgar. Any straightforward attack would fail and expose Erebus to consequences he couldn't manipulate his way out of. No, this required the kind of betrayal Erebus specialized in: personal, cruel, and delivered at the moment when the victim would never see it coming. On the world of New Syria, as the Shadow Crusade reached the planet that had broken Angron, Erebus saw his opportunity. The forces were spread across the surface, fighting their way through the High Rider's last desperate defenses. Argel Tal stood before the Imperator-class Titan Corinthian, a walking god machine that loomed above the battlefield. At the top of the Titan was an enormous Imperial Aquila, a carved eagle with wings spread wide. Great wings. The shadow of great wings. Erebus approached from behind, a Thami blade already drawn. The blade was a weapon of enormous power, forged in the warp and capable of truly killing even the most resilient targets. And Erebus drove it into Argel Tal's back, right through his primary heart and deep into his torso. It was a killing blow delivered without warning, without honor, without any chance for the victim to defend himself. Argel Tal fell, his blood staining the soil of Nuceria. In his final moments, standing in the shadow of the Corinthians' wings just as Raum had always predicted, the Crimson Lord of the Gal Vorbak died. Not in glorious battle, not facing impossible odds for a noble cause, but murdered by a supposed ally who had decided he was inconvenient to destiny's plans. The demon Raum left with his host's death, severing the connection that had bound them for years. The Gal Vorbak, psychically linked to their commander, felt him die and knew that something irreplaceable had been lost. And when word reached Kharn about what had happened, about who was responsible, something broke inside the World Eater that would never be repaired. The relationship between Argel Tal and Raum deserves deeper examination because it represented something unique in the Warhammer 40,000 setting. Most possessed Space Marines became nothing more than flesh puppets for their demonic occupants. The demon would take control, using the Astartes' enhanced body as a weapon, while the original personality either died or retreated into some dark corner of their shared consciousness, screaming unheard. But Argel Tal and Raum existed in genuine partnership. The Crimson Lord retained full agency over his actions, able to suppress the demon when necessary and call upon its power when useful. They argued, disagreed, even fought for control at times. But they also learned from each other, demon and mortal existing in a state that neither fully controlled but both influenced. This made Argel Tal exceptional, even among the word-bearers, a legion that prided itself on understanding chaos better than any other. He represented the possibility that corruption didn't have to mean loss of self, that one could bargain with demons and still retain humanity. Lorgar valued him precisely because of this, seeing in the Crimson Lord evidence that his vision of enlightened chaos worship could actually work. The other members of the Gal Vorbak looked to Argel Tal for guidance on how to manage their own possessions. Some succeeded better than others. A few, like Argel Tal, maintained clear boundaries with their demonic passengers. Others struggled constantly, fighting mental battles that exhausted them even when physically inactive. And still others simply surrendered, letting their demons dominate and accepting the loss of self that followed. Argel Tal's friendship with Kharn was built on this shared experience of hosting something inhuman. They understood each other in ways their brothers couldn't. When Kharn described the sensation of the butcher's nails singing in his skull, driving him toward violence, whether he wanted it or not, Argel Tal knew exactly what he meant. When Argel Tal spoke about negotiating with Raum, about maintaining himself against a presence that wanted to reshape him entirely, Kharn understood that struggle intimately. This mutual understanding created a bond that transcended normal brotherhood. They weren't just comrades in arms or fellow warriors serving the same cause. They were mirrors for each other, reflections showing what the other might become if they lost their battles with the inhuman things living inside them. In each other, they saw both warning and hope. Warning of what complete loss of control would mean. Hope that maintaining themselves remained possible. Their conversations during the Shadow Crusade revealed depths that neither man typically showed to others. Kharn admitted his fear that he was losing himself piece by piece, that every battle brought him closer to becoming nothing but a mindless killer. Argel Tal confessed his suspicion that Raum was slowly reshaping his personality even when he thought he maintained control, that he might wake up one day and discover he'd become something else without noticing the transformation. These weren't the kinds of discussions Space Marines typically had. The Legionese Astartes were warriors first, designed to be weapons rather than philosophers. Vulnerability wasn't encouraged, doubt wasn't acceptable, fear was meant to be suppressed or denied. But Kharn and Argel Tal gave each other permission to be uncertain, to acknowledge their struggles, to admit that they didn't have all the answers. This made Argel Tal's death even more devastating for Kharn. He lost not just a friend, but a confessor, not just a brother, but someone who understood the specifics of his struggle in ways no one else could. The World Eater had opened himself up, had allowed himself to be vulnerable with someone, and that someone had been murdered by a scheming chaplain who viewed people as nothing more than pieces to be removed from the game board. Erebus thought he had removed an obstacle. What he'd actually done was sign his own death warrant. He just didn't know it yet. The murder that changed everything. The aftermath of Argel Tal's death rippled through both legions like shockwaves from an orbital bombardment. When word reached Lorgar about what his first chaplain had done, the Urizen's reaction surprised everyone present. Rather than punish Erebus, rather than express outrage at this unprovoked murder of one of his most valued warriors, Lorgar simply told Kharn what had happened and who was responsible. That moment, that single decision by Lorgar, has been debated by historians and law scholars for decades. Did the Primarch know what would follow? Was this his way of dispensing justice while maintaining plausible deniability? Or was he simply informing Kharn as a courtesy, letting the World Eater know why his friend wouldn't be returning from the battlefield? The text of Betrayer doesn't provide a clear answer, leaving this as one of those delicious ambiguities that makes the Warhammer 40,000 setting so compelling. What we know with certainty is Kharn's reaction. The World Eater didn't explode into immediate violence. He didn't scream or rage or smash everything around him in berserker fury. Instead, he went very, very quiet. Those who knew Kharn, who had fought beside him for decades, recognized this as far more dangerous than any display of temper. When Kharn got quiet, when that particular cold focus descended over him, it meant someone was going to die. The butcher's nails must have been shrieking in his skull, amplifying his grief into incandescent rage. Every fiber of his being probably wanted to just find Erebus immediately and rip him apart with bare hands. But Kharn was still Kharn, still capable of strategy, even through the red haze of fury. He understood something fundamental. If he simply attacked Erebus, the word-bearers might defend their first chaplain. Legion warfare could erupt aboard the Conqueror, brother turning against brother, alliance fracturing at the worst possible moment. No, this required a different approach. This required using the World Eater's own customs against Erebus in a way the word-bearer couldn't refuse without losing face entirely. The fighting pits had been a feature of the World Eaters since their days as the Warhounds. These weren't casual sparring sessions or simple training exercises. These were ritualized combat zones where disputes were settled. Honor was proven, and warriors tested themselves against their brothers. The pits had strict rules. Once challenged, you could not refuse without being branded a coward. Fights continued until one combatant was unable to continue, either through surrender or incapacitation. And what happened in the pits stayed in the pits. Personal business settled through personal violence without bringing the wider legion into it. Erebus had participated in these pit fights during the Shadow Crusade. He'd won several matches, earning a reputation as a skilled duelist. He styled himself as a warrior priest, someone who balanced spiritual authority with martial prowess. This reputation was important to him, part of his carefully cultivated image as more than just a scheming chaplain. Kharn challenged him to sanguis extremis, to the bloodiest extreme, the most intense form of pit fight the World Eaters recognized. This wasn't a friendly match or a practice bout. This was combat to the point of absolute defeat, where surrender might not even be accepted, where the point was to demonstrate total dominance over your opponent. By invoking sanguis extremis, Kharn was making a statement that this was personal, that this was about more than just a simple duel. Erebus found himself in a trap of his own making. If he refused the challenge, he would be branded a coward in front of 2 entire legions. His carefully maintained reputation would crumble. The World Eaters would mock him, and worse, his own word-bearers might question his courage. But if he accepted, he would have to face a grief-mad World Eater captain whose best friend he'd just murdered. In a form of combat where the aggressor could literally beat him to death with no consequences. There was no good option for Erebus. Every path forward led to pain. But his arrogance, his absolute conviction that he was smarter than everyone around him, led him to believe he could still salvage the situation. He was skilled in single combat. He had demon-forged weapons and blessings from the Chaos Gods. Kharn was just a line captain, albeit a decorated one. Surely Erebus could win this fight, could demonstrate his superiority, and then the whole embarrassing incident would be forgotten. The first chaplain had no idea what was about to happen to him, because he'd made the same mistake so many manipulators make. He'd confused cleverness with competence, planning with power, and talking with doing. Erebus could scheme and plot and manipulate, but when it came to a straight fight against a warrior who wanted him dead, all that cunning meant exactly nothing. Word of the challenge spread through both legions faster than Vox transmissions could carry it. Everyone knew about Argeltal's death. Everyone knew Erebus was responsible. And now, everyone knew Kharn was going to do something about it. Space Marines from both the Word-Bearers and World Eaters gathered around the fighting pit on the Conqueror, drawn by the spectacle of justice about to be delivered in the most brutal and direct manner possible. The atmosphere must have been electric. World Eaters, who had served with Kharn for decades, who respected him as one of the few officers who could think straight while the nails were singing. Word-Bearers, who had known Argeltal, who mourned the Crimson Lord and understood that Erebus had crossed a line that shouldn't have been crossed. And everyone, from both legions, who had been manipulated by the first chaplain at some point, who had suspected his schemes, who wanted to see the master manipulator face consequences for once in his miserable existence. Even those who didn't particularly care about Argeltal or Kharn recognized this as something special. This was going to be a spectacle, a reckoning, the kind of fight that would be talked about for years afterward, passed down as a story to new recruits, remembered as the time when Erebus finally got what was coming to him. Kharn walked into the pit with the kind of calm that terrified anyone who knew him. He wasn't raging. He wasn't screaming threats. He was quiet, focused, moving with the deliberate grace of a warrior who had already decided exactly how this was going to end. The butcher's nails must have been at maximum intensity, screaming for blood, for violence, for the primal satisfaction of killing. But Kharn had them under control, barely, channeling all that fury into cold purpose. Erebus walked in confident. The first chaplain probably still thought he could talk his way out of this, or manipulate the situation, or use his skills to turn the fight to his advantage. He stood there in his armor, weapons ready, probably calculating angles and weaknesses the way manipulators always do. And then the fight began, the challenge, when fury found its voice. The fighting pit aboard the Conqueror had witnessed countless battles during the Shadow Crusade. World Eaters regularly settled disputes there, working out their aggression in controlled environments, rather than letting the butcher's nails drive them to murder their own brothers in uncontrolled frenzies. The pit itself was a circular depression in the deck, surrounded by tiers where spectators could watch the violence unfold. Simple, utilitarian, designed for function rather than spectacle, like everything else the World Eaters created. But there had never been a fight quite like this one. Not in this pit, not in any pit the World Eaters maintained. Because this wasn't about honor or proving yourself or working out aggression. This was about justice, delivered through violence, because violence was the only language that mattered in the end. Erebus had already fought several times in the pits during the campaign. He'd faced various World Eaters and won more often than he lost, using a combination of genuine skill and tactical awareness to overcome opponents who relied more on raw fury than technique. After each victory, he would accept the grudging respect of his opponents, maintaining his image as a warrior priest who walked the walk as well as talking the talk. The gathering crowd that assembled for the Kharn challenge was different from those previous audiences. There was an anticipation in the air, a barely restrained eagerness that you could almost taste. Word-bearers and World Eaters packed the observation tiers, standing shoulder to shoulder in a unity that transcended legion loyalties. They weren't there to watch a sporting contest or witness a test of skill. They were there to watch Erebus get destroyed. Brother Captain Latara Sarin, the Conqueror's ship mistress and one of the few baseline humans who commanded respect from the World Eaters, was present. She'd known Kharn for years, had worked with him throughout the Great Crusade and into the heresy. She understood what this moment meant to him, and she would later describe the atmosphere in the pit as anticipation mixed with bloodlust, mixed with hope. Hope. That word matters, because in the grimdark future of Warhammer 40,000, hope is a rare commodity. The warriors gathered around that pit, traitors all, damned souls who had turned their backs on the Emperor and embraced chaos, experienced something like hope as they waited to watch Kharn beat the architect of so much of their suffering into a pulp. Kharn entered the pit first, descending the steps with measured calm. He'd removed his armor, as pit combat required. Space Marines fought these duels in their bodysuits, the skin-suit undergarments they wore beneath power armor. This made the fights more personal, more visceral, removed some of the protection that power armor provided, while still allowing for superhuman strength and durability to shine through. His chain axe, Gorechild, was absent. This wasn't a fight for weapons, at least not at first. Kharn wanted to do this with his hands, wanted to feel every impact, wanted Erebus to understand that no amount of skill or cunning would save him from the fundamental reality of physical superiority driven by absolute fury. Erebus followed, still confident, still moving like a man who expected to win. He'd removed his own armor as well, standing there in his bodysuit with nothing but his faith in his own abilities to protect him. Looking at the assembled crowd, seeing World Eaters and Word-bearers alike, he probably understood on some level that he was screwed. But Erebus's essential nature wouldn't allow him to back down, wouldn't let him show weakness. He'd spent his entire life manipulating others, and he genuinely believed that intelligence and cunning mattered more than raw power. He was about to learn differently. The traditional opening of a pit fight involved both combatants acknowledging the other, a brief moment of respect before violence began. Erebus opened his mouth, probably planning to say something clever, to make some remark that would position him as the reasonable one, the civilized one, facing a grief-mad barbarian. Kharn didn't let him finish. The World Eater crossed the distance between them faster than most observers could track, moving with the kind of speed that transhuman physiology permitted. His first punch caught Erebus in the face, snapping the word-bearer's head back and probably breaking his nose. The first chaplain stumbled, surprise evident even through the pain, and that's when he realized just how badly he'd miscalculated. This wasn't going to be a duel. This was going to be a beating. The fight. A beatdown for the ages. What followed has been analyzed and discussed by Warhammer 40,000 fans, with the kind of intense focus usually reserved for religious texts. Every punch, every moment, every word spoken during the fight has been dissected and celebrated, because this wasn't just a fight. It was catharsis made physical, justice delivered through violence, and the rare satisfaction of watching a character who absolutely deserved punishment finally receiving it. Kharn's first strike had been just the beginning. As Erebus staggered back, trying to recover from the surprise attack, Kharn was already following up. The World Eater moved with methodical precision, not the wild frenzy you might expect from someone with the butcher's nails, but rather the calculated violence of a warrior who knew exactly what he was doing. Erebus tried to mount a defense. He was skilled after all, trained for decades in the arts of close combat. He attempted a counterattack, a sweeping blow that should have connected with Kharn's torso, but the World Eater simply tanked it, accepted the hit without even flinching, and delivered another crushing punch to Erebus's face in return. This was when the first chaplain started to understand what was happening. He wasn't fighting a warrior, he was fighting a force of nature. Kharn had accepted that he was going to take damage, had decided that pain meant nothing compared to the goal of utterly destroying the person in front of him. Every technique Erebus tried, every trained response drilled into him through years of practice, meant nothing against an opponent who simply didn't care about defense. Kharn backed Erebus across the pit with a series of punishing blows. A fist to the ribs that cracked ceramite-hard bone, an elbow strike that snapped teeth, a knee to the gut that folded the word-bearer double. Each impact was delivered with superhuman strength, amplified by the rage the butcher's nails provided, and Kharn wasn't slowing down. The physics of what was happening deserve examination, because Space Marine combat operates at a level that defies normal human experience. Each punch Kharn threw carried enough force to shatter concrete, to dent tank armor, to pulverize bone that was denser and stronger than anything baseline humans possessed. Erebus's enhanced physiology, which made him vastly more durable than any ordinary soldier, might as well have been wet paper against this assault. And Kharn wasn't just strong, he was fast. The butcher's nails, for all their horrific effects, did enhance reaction time and combat reflexes. They turned off the brain's natural limiters, the safeguards that prevent normal people from exerting their full strength and damaging themselves in the process. A Space Marine with the nails could move faster, hit harder, and keep fighting longer than one without, paying for these advantages with sanity and long-term neurological damage. But in that pit, facing Erebus, those costs meant nothing to Kharn. He was a weapon perfectly designed for this specific purpose, beating an opponent so thoroughly that they would never forget it. Every aspect of his enhanced physiology, every modification made to transform him from a baseline human into a transhuman warrior, every psychological conditioning and every physical augmentation, all of it aligned toward making him unstoppable in close combat. Erebus tried technique. He was trained, after all, skilled in the martial arts that Space Marine chaplains learned as part of their duties. He attempted blocks and counters, tried to create distance, looked for openings that would let him launch his own attacks. But technique requires the ability to think clearly, to assess situations, and respond appropriately. And Kharn was hitting him too hard, too fast, giving him no opportunity to recover or regroup. The word-bearer's vision blurred from repeated impacts to his head. His balance failed him as damage accumulated to his inner ear. His hands, trying to ward off blows, took such punishment that bones cracked and nerves tore. He was being systematically dismantled, reduced from a proud first chaplain to a broken thing barely clinging to consciousness. The crowd's reaction intensified with every blow. World Eaters whooped and cheered, their own nails probably singing in response to the violence they witnessed. Word-bearers watched with expressions that ranged from satisfaction to shock. Some had known Erebus for centuries, had served under him, had followed his guidance as they fell to chaos. Seeing him reduced to this state probably triggered complicated emotions. Satisfaction that the manipulator was finally facing consequences, but also unease at how completely he was being dominated. Erebus went down, fell to his knees in the center of the pit, blood flowing from his broken face, barely able to breathe through the pain radiating from his torso. For just a moment, he might have thought the worst was over, that he'd survived the initial assault and could recover, could salvage something from this disaster. Then, Kharn's hand closed around his throat. The World Eater lifted Erebus bodily, holding the first chaplain up with one arm while delivering punishing strikes with his free hand. Face, torso, anywhere he could reach became a target. Erebus tried to break free, tried to fight back, but he might as well have been struggling against a freight train. Kharn's grip was unbreakable, his assault relentless. And then came the moment that turned this from merely a severe beating into legend. Kharn's fist connected with Erebus's face with enough force to shear away several of the word-bearer's fingers when he tried to block. The digits went flying, lost somewhere in the pit, and Erebus screamed. Actually screamed, something he probably thought himself above doing. The master manipulator, the architect of the Horus heresy, reduced to making wordless sounds of pain and terror. But Kharn wasn't done. He knocked Erebus down again, then picked up one of the severed fingers from where it had fallen. And he did something so absurd, so darkly amusing, that the watching crowd erupted into laughter despite themselves. According to accounts that have become part of Warhammer 40,000 folklore, Kharn curled the severed finger into a fist and began using it like a makeshift knuckle duster to beat Erebus. Some retellings claim he actually said "stop hitting yourself" with each blow, though whether this actually happened or is embellishment added later remains debated. What matters is that Kharn found a way to turn even dismemberment into further humiliation for his opponent. Erebus tried to crawl away. The first chaplain, who had orchestrated the downfall of entire legions, who had corrupted primarchs and destroyed worlds, was reduced to trying to escape on his hands and knees while Kharn stalked behind him. Every attempt to flee earned another crushing blow. Every moment brought fresh pain and new humiliation. The crowd watched in something approaching rapture. World Eaters whooped and cheered, their aggression finding vicarious release through Kharn's assault. Word-bearers who had served under Erebus for decades watched with satisfaction as their manipulative superior finally faced consequences. Even those who might have disagreed with the brutality couldn't help but acknowledge the justice of it. Kharn grabbed Erebus by the skull and lifted him again, this time slamming the word-bearer face first into the pit's floor with enough force to crack the deck plating. Once, twice, 3 times. Each impact left a blood spray and probably rattled Erebus's brain inside his skull like dice in a cup. By this point, the first chaplain had to be questioning every decision that had led him to this moment. But Kharn still wasn't done. Because this wasn't just about hurting Erebus. This was about making a statement that would echo through both legions. This was about showing that manipulators and schemers could talk all they wanted, but at the end of the day, direct action mattered more than clever plans. This was about making Erebus understand, viscerally, that he was not untouchable. The beating continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Time has a strange quality in moments of intense violence, stretching and compressing in ways that make accurate measurement difficult. What we know is that by the time Kharn stepped back, Erebus was unrecognizable. His face was a ruined mess of broken bone and torn flesh. His body was covered in impact trauma that would have killed a baseline human several times over. He lay in a spreading pool of his own blood, barely conscious, beaten so thoroughly that even his enhanced physiology struggled to keep him alive. And through all of this, Kharn remained calm, eerily calm. The rage that drove him wasn't the wild berserker fury that defined most world eaters under the influence of the butcher's nails. It was cold, controlled, channeled into methodical violence that achieved its purpose with absolute certainty. This was Kharn at his most dangerous, not mindless, but rather focused entirely on a goal with every fiber of his superhuman being dedicated to achieving it. The crowd, understanding that they'd witnessed something extraordinary, reacted with the kind of celebration you'd expect from sports fans watching their team win a championship. Cheering, laughter, the satisfaction of seeing justice delivered in the most direct possible manner. For just a moment, traitors and heretics all, they felt something pure and good. The simple pleasure of watching an asshole get exactly what he deserved. The aftermath, and Erebus's cowardly escape. Kharn stood over Erebus's broken body, breathing heavily, but showing none of the fatigue that should have affected him after such a prolonged and vicious assault. The butcher's nails probably screamed in his skull, flooding his system with combat drugs and endorphins, turning the pain from his own injuries into something almost pleasurable. But beneath that chemical high, beneath the rage that had driven him to this moment, there must have been grief. Argel Tal was still dead. The beating he'd delivered to Erebus, satisfying as it had been, couldn't change that fundamental fact. His friend, his honor brother, the one person who could reach him through the red haze when the nails threatened to overwhelm him completely, was gone. And all Kharn had been able to do was make the person responsible suffer for it. For a moment, it seemed like Kharn might finish the job, that he would deliver one final, killing blow and end Erebus permanently. The first chaplain certainly couldn't defend himself anymore, barely clinging to consciousness as his enhanced physiology struggled to keep him alive. One more strike would do it. One more application of force, and the architect of so much suffering would be gone. But Kharn hesitated. Maybe it was exhaustion finally catching up to him. Maybe it was the realization that killing Erebus wouldn't bring Argel Tal back. Maybe. Somewhere in the part of himself he was desperately trying to hold on to, He recognized that executing a helpless opponent crossed a line he wasn't ready to step over. We don't know for certain what stayed his hand. What we do know is that Erebus took advantage of that moment of hesitation. The first chaplain, beaten to the point where his own mother wouldn't recognize him, had one final trick up his sleeve: teleportation. Throughout the Horus Heresy, Erebus had demonstrated access to sorcery and warp-based abilities far beyond what most chaplains possessed. He'd been initiated into the deepest mysteries of chaos, had made bargains with the ruinous powers themselves, and now, lying broken in a pool of his own blood, he called upon those powers to save him from the consequences of his actions. The teleport must have hurt. Taking his broken body and shoving it through the warp, moving him from the Conqueror to anywhere else where Kharn couldn't immediately kill him. But pain was preferable to death, and Erebus had always excelled at self-preservation above all else. One moment he was there, a broken mess barely clinging to life. The next moment, he was simply gone, vanished in a flash of warp energy that left behind nothing but displaced air and the stench of the Imperium. The crowd erupted again, but this time with frustration rather than celebration. Erebus had escaped. The coward had actually used sorcery to run away rather than face the full consequences of what he'd done. It was so perfectly on brand for his character, so utterly predictable, that it almost wrapped back around to being funny. Almost. Kharn stood there, staring at the spot where Erebus had been, and you have to wonder what went through his mind in that moment. Relief that he hadn't had to make the choice about whether to deliver that killing blow. Fury that Erebus had escaped justice yet again. Resignation that manipulators like the first chaplain always seem to slither away at the last possible moment. We know that Kharn simply turned and walked away from the pit. Didn't celebrate, didn't acknowledge the cheering crowd, just left. He'd accomplished what he set out to do. Deliver a beating so severe that Erebus would remember it for the rest of his unnaturally long life. That would have to be enough, because revenge is never as satisfying as we want it to be. In the immediate aftermath, the World Eaters and Word-bearers who had witnessed the fight spread word of what they'd seen. Stories of Kharn's assault on Erebus became legend within hours, passed between warriors with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for tales of great victories. The details got exaggerated in the retelling, of course. The beating became longer, more savage, with each version adding new elements of brutality. But the core truth remained unchanged. Kharn had beaten Erebus so thoroughly that the first chaplain had been forced to teleport away to save his own life. That fact, that single undeniable reality, echoed through both legions and eventually spread to the wider traitor forces. Erebus had been humiliated in the most public possible way, his reputation as a warrior shattered along with most of the bones in his face. For Erebus himself, the experience must have been traumatic in ways that transcended mere physical injury. His body would heal, given time and the corrupting blessings of chaos. But his ego, his sense of superiority, his absolute conviction that he was smarter than everyone around him, had taken a beating that would never fully recover. He'd been forced to confront the reality that sometimes manipulation and schemes mean nothing when faced with direct violence from someone who simply doesn't care about your clever plans. The first chaplain would continue operating throughout the rest of the heresy, would continue his manipulations and schemes. But he never forgot what Kharn did to him in that pit. According to later accounts, Erebus avoided the World Eater for the remainder of the war, always finding reasons to be elsewhere whenever Kharn was near. The master manipulator had learned to fear the direct approach. As for Kharn, the fight marked a turning point in his slow transformation from the captain who tried to hold it together into the betrayer he would become. Argel Tal's death removed the last stabilizing influence in his life, the last voice that could pull him back from the edge. Without that friendship, without someone who understood what he was going through, Kharn had nothing to anchor him except the nails and the endless call to violence they represented. But before he fully embraced that destiny, before he became the champion of Kharn who would fight for 10,000 years, Kharn had one moment of perfect clarity. One moment where he delivered justice to someone who absolutely deserved it, where he made a manipulator pay for his manipulations, where he demonstrated that sometimes the straightforward approach beats cleverness every single time. And everyone cheered. Why the fandom erupted in cheers. To understand why the Warhammer 40,000 fandom reacted to this scene with such overwhelming enthusiasm, we need to examine what Erebus represents in the broader context of the setting and the Horus Heresy series specifically. Because the fight wasn't just satisfying in isolation, it was the payoff to storylines that had been building across multiple books, the resolution to tensions that readers had been experiencing for years of real-world time. Erebus, more than any other character in the Horus Heresy, embodied the particular kind of villain that audiences love to hate. He wasn't powerful in the traditional sense. He couldn't fight a Primarch one-on-one and win. He wasn't a demon prince with reality-warping abilities. He was just a very clever, very manipulative space marine who happened to be in the right place at the right time to orchestrate disaster after disaster. But what made him truly despicable was his attitude. Erebus genuinely believed he was the smartest person in every room. He viewed other people as pieces to be moved around a game board, obstacles to be removed, or tools to be used. He showed no remorse for the billions of deaths he'd caused, no regret for the friendships he'd destroyed, no recognition that his actions had consequences beyond his immediate plans. He was smug, self-satisfied, and utterly convinced of his own superiority. Readers had watched Erebus operate for over 20 books in the Horus Heresy series by the time Betrayer was published. They'd seen him corrupt Horus, orchestrate the Istvan massacres, manipulate Primarchs, and generally make himself indispensable to the traitor cause while suffering minimal consequences for his actions. Even when his plans failed, even when other characters started to suspect his manipulations, Erebus would slip away unharmed. This created a building frustration among readers. Here was a character who deserved to face consequences, who had earned punishment through his actions, but who kept skating by through cleverness and preparation. The Horus Heresy setting is grimdark, yes, but readers still want some form of justice, some acknowledgement that villains can't simply do whatever they want without repercussions. Then came Argel Tal's death, and readers felt it personally. Aaron Dembski Bowden had written Argel Tal as a genuinely sympathetic character, someone who retained his humanity despite being possessed by a demon, someone whose friendship with Kharn felt authentic and earned. The Crimson Lord's death wasn't just a plot point, it was the loss of one of the few genuinely good people left in a story filled with monsters and villains, and Erebus killed him with a backstab. The most cowardly possible method, attacking from behind while Argel Tal was focused on the battle ahead of him. It was perfectly in character for Erebus, perfectly in line with his established methods, but it made readers furious. Here was this character they'd grown to hate, killing one of the few characters they actually liked, and doing it in the most dishonorable way possible. So when Kharn challenged Erebus to single combat, when the setup made it clear that the first chaplain was going to get his ass kicked, readers approached those pages with an anticipation that bordered on religious fervor. Finally, after 20+ books of watching Erebus scheme and manipulate and escape consequences, someone was going to beat the absolute hell out of him. And Aaron Dembski Bowden delivered. He didn't hold back, didn't make it a close fight, didn't give Erebus some last-minute save that preserved his dignity. He wrote Kharn, dismantling the first chaplain so thoroughly that readers could almost feel every punch. The scene was visceral, brutal, and deeply satisfying on a level that transcended normal storytelling. The internet exploded in response. Forums dedicated to Warhammer 40,000 lit up with discussions of the fight. Readers shared their favorite moments, quoted the most brutal parts, celebrated the fact that justice had finally been delivered. The phrase "fuck Erebus" became a rallying cry, a meme that persists to this day. Type those two words into any Warhammer community and you'll receive instant agreement from everyone present. This wasn't just about Erebus getting beaten. It was about catharsis, about the satisfaction of seeing a character who operated through manipulation and schemes finally face direct consequences delivered through direct means. It was about the recognition that sometimes the solution to a manipulator isn't out-scheming them. Sometimes you just need to walk up and punch them in the face repeatedly until they stop being a problem. The fandom's reaction also speaks to something deeper about why we engage with fiction in the first place. We read stories, watch movies, play games because they offer us experiences and emotions we can't easily access in real life. In our day-to-day existence, we can't simply beat up people who wrong us. We have laws, social constraints, consequences that prevent us from resolving conflicts through violence. But fiction gives us a space to experience that kind of direct justice vicariously, safely, without any real-world harm. Kharn fighting Erebus became iconic because it tapped into that primal desire for justice, for accountability, for the satisfaction of watching someone who absolutely deserved punishment finally receive it in the most unambiguous possible way. No legal loopholes, no clever escapes, no talking his way out of consequences. Just a superior warrior beating him until he couldn't fight back anymore. The scene also worked because of who delivered the beating. Kharn wasn't a hero in any traditional sense. He was a traitor space marine with murder implants in his brain, fighting for the forces of chaos, destined to become one of the most bloodthirsty champions the galaxy had ever seen. But in that moment, facing Erebus, he became a vehicle for justice. He became the instrument through which readers could experience the satisfaction of seeing Erebus punished. Fan art of the scene proliferated across the internet. Artists drew their interpretations of Kharn standing over Erebus, of the moment when the first chaplain realized he was about to get destroyed, of the crowd watching in satisfaction. These images ranged from serious artistic interpretations to deliberately humorous takes, but they all captured the same essential emotion. This was a moment worth celebrating. The artistic response to the scene revealed different aspects of what made it resonate with audiences. Some artists focused on Kharn's expression, trying to capture the cold fury that drove him throughout the beating. They showed him not as a raging berserker, but as someone absolutely committed to a purpose, methodical in his violence. These interpretations emphasized the deliberate nature of what Kharn was doing, the fact that this wasn't mindless rage, but calculated justice. Other artists focused on Erebus, depicting the moment when his confidence crumbled and he realized how badly he'd miscalculated. These works captured the transition from smug superiority to genuine terror, from manipulator to victim. They showed a character who had always relied on cleverness and schemes suddenly facing the reality that none of that mattered against direct physical violence. Still, other artists depicted the crowd, showing the mixture of Space Marines from both legions united in their appreciation of what they were witnessing. These images emphasized the communal aspect of the scene, the fact that this wasn't just about Kharn and Erebus, but about two entire legions acknowledging that justice was being delivered. The memes that emerged from the scene took various forms. Some were simple text overlays on screenshots from Warhammer games or artwork, capturing memorable quotes or imagined dialogue. Others were elaborate edits, combining imagery from multiple sources to create humorous scenarios. The "fuck Erebus" phrase became so ubiquitous in Warhammer communities that it transcended the specific scene, becoming shorthand for the entire fandom's antipathy toward the character. This mimetic spread served an important function beyond just humor. It created a shared language among Warhammer fans, a way of signaling membership in the community and shared understanding of the lore. Saying "fuck Erebus" or referencing the fight became a shibboleth, instantly identifying someone as familiar enough with the Horus Heresy series to know about this particular scene and its significance. The scene also sparked discussions about narrative structure and character development in grimdark fiction. Literary analysts and storytelling enthusiasts examined what made the moment work so effectively, breaking down the elements that combined to create such powerful catharsis. These discussions recognized that Aaron Dembski-Bowden hadn't just written a good fight scene. He'd constructed a perfect payoff to threads that had been building across multiple books. Some of these analyses focused on the build-up. They noted how Erebus had been established across numerous books as this untouchable schemer, how readers had watched him manipulate events with minimal consequences, how his continued survival despite his actions created narrative tension that demanded resolution. The fight represented the release of that tension, the acknowledgement that yes, sometimes villains do face consequences. Other analyses examined the execution of the scene itself. They praised Dembski-Bowden's decision to make the fight one-sided rather than evenly matched, recognizing that readers didn't want to see a fair contest. They wanted to see Erebus dominated, overwhelmed, reduced to nothing by a superior warrior fighting for something beyond just victory. The scene delivered exactly that, refusing to pull punches or soften the brutality of what Kharn inflicted. Still, other discussions focused on the aftermath and implications. They explored how the scene affected both characters' subsequent development, how it resonated through the larger narrative of the Horus Heresy, how it demonstrated that even in a grimdark setting, moments of satisfaction and justice remain possible. These analyses recognized that the fight wasn't just entertaining in isolation, but served important functions in the broader story being told. The academic interest in the scene spoke to something important about Warhammer 40,000's place in popular culture. This wasn't just a niche hobby for tabletop gaming enthusiasts anymore. The Horus Heresy series had achieved enough cultural penetration that literary critics and storytelling experts felt comfortable analyzing its narrative techniques and examining what made certain moments resonate with audiences. The fight between Kharn and Erebus became a case study in how to deliver satisfying payoff in long-form serialized fiction. The stop-hitting-yourself moment, whether it actually happened in the text or was added by fan interpretation, became particularly beloved. It represented the perfect blend of brutal violence and dark humor, turning even dismemberment into something darkly amusing. Erebus didn't just get beaten. He got humiliated in a way that readers found genuinely funny, despite the grimdark setting. Years after Betrayer's publication, the fight remains one of the most discussed moments in the entire Horus Heresy series. New readers encountering it for the first time report the same surge of satisfaction that original readers experienced. The scene has achieved a kind of immortality in the fandom, referenced constantly, celebrated regularly, held up as an example of the kind of moment that makes the Warhammer 40,000 setting worthwhile, despite all its darkness. This speaks to Aaron Dembski-Bowden's skill as a writer. He understood what readers needed at that point in the story. He recognized that Erebus had built up so much narrative debt that readers required payoff, needed to see consequences delivered in a visceral and unambiguous way, and he delivered that payoff without pulling punches, trusting his audience to appreciate the brutal honesty of the scene. The fight also demonstrated something important about character development in grimdark settings. You can have manipulators, schemers, characters who operate through subterfuge and backstabbing. But if they never face consequences, if they always escape unharmed, readers will grow frustrated. They need to see that actions have repercussions, that even the cleverest manipulator can be brought low. Kharn beating Erebus provided that essential narrative function while also being supremely entertaining. The ripples through history. The fight between Kharn and Erebus represented more than just personal revenge. It marked a turning point in both characters' arcs, setting them on paths that would echo through 10,000 years of galactic history. Understanding these consequences requires examining what came after, how that moment in the fighting pit influenced the larger narrative of the Warhammer 40,000 setting. For Kharn, Tal's death and the subsequent beating of Erebus represented the breaking of the last chain that bound him to something resembling humanity. His friend had been the one person who could reach him when the butcher's nails threatened to overwhelm him completely, who could remind him that he was more than just a weapon. With Tal gone, that stabilizing influence vanished. The transformation of Kharn into Kharn the Betrayer accelerated after this point. He threw himself into battle with increasing frequency and ferocity, seeking in violence the release he could no longer find in friendship. The nails sang their song of slaughter in his skull, and he stopped fighting them quite so hard. Why bother maintaining control when control hadn't saved Tal? Why cling to humanity when being human just meant feeling loss? The moment that would earn Kharn his infamous epithet came later. On the demon world of Scalathrax, there, the World Eaters faced the Emperor's children in a battle for control of the planet. As night fell and deadly cold threatened to kill victor and vanquished alike, most warriors retreated to shelter, planning to resume fighting when the sun rose. Kharn, consumed by the nails and by grief that had curdled into perpetual rage, couldn't accept this pause in the bloodshed. He set fire to his own legion's shelters, forcing his brothers back into the frozen night to fight or freeze. In doing so, he shattered the World Eaters' cohesion as a unified force, fragmenting them into the scattered warbands they would remain for millennia. His brothers called him betrayer for this act, but the seeds of that betrayal were planted when Erebus murdered Tal, and Kharn lost the last person who made him want to be better than the nails demanded. For the next 10,000 years, Kharn would fight, not for strategic goals or military objectives, but simply because violence was all he had left. He became the champion of Kharn, the blood god's favored mortal instrument, embodying senseless slaughter in its purest form. Every battle added to the tally kept by the arcane counter installed in his helmet. Every death another offering to a god who cared nothing for his suffering. But somewhere in that endless rampage, buried beneath 10 millennia of carnage, the memory of that fight with Erebus must have remained. The last time Kharn had fought for something beyond just the joy of killing. The last time his violence had purpose beyond feeding the blood god. The last time he'd delivered justice rather than simply murder. Erebus, for his part, survived the heresy to become one of the ruling Dark Apostles of the Word-Bearers Legion. He continued his schemes and manipulations, continued serving the Chaos Gods with absolute devotion. But he never forgot what Kharn did to him in that pit. The humiliation, the pain, the moment when all his cleverness meant nothing against direct violence, scarred him in ways that transcended physical injury. In the 10,000 years since, Erebus has carefully avoided Kharn whenever possible. The two have crossed paths occasionally during Black Crusades and other large-scale chaos operations, but Erebus always finds reasons to be elsewhere when the betrayer is near. The fear Kharn instilled in him that day on the Conqueror never quite faded, a reminder that he's not as untouchable as he pretends to be. The fight also influenced how other characters in the setting viewed both warriors. Kharn's reputation as someone who solved problems through direct application of violence was cemented. Warriors of other legions knew that challenging him meant risking the kind of beating Erebus had received, and most chose to give him a wide berth as a result. Erebus, conversely, found his reputation as a warrior permanently tarnished. Oh, he remained influential among the word-bearers, his political and spiritual authority intact. But no one quite looked at him the same way after he'd been forced to teleport away from a pit fight he was losing. The aura of superiority he'd cultivated for so long had cracks in it that no amount of scheming could repair. The scene also established a template for how direct action could triumph over manipulation in the Warhammer 40,000 setting. Other authors writing in the universe took note of the fandom's reaction, understanding that readers appreciated seeing schemers face consequences delivered through straightforward violence. While not every manipulator character received the Erebus treatment, The fight demonstrated that such moments resonated powerfully with audiences. In the broader narrative of the Horus Heresy, the fight represented a microcosm of larger themes the series explored. The tension between manipulation and direct action. The question of whether cleverness or strength mattered more in a galaxy at war. The recognition that even the best-laid plans could be disrupted by a warrior who simply didn't care about your schemes. The loss of Argel Tal also rippled through the Wordbearers Legion in ways that affected their subsequent development. The Gal Vorbak, the first possessed space marines, never quite recovered from losing their leader. The Crimson Lord had been their inspiration, the proof that possession didn't have to mean losing yourself entirely. Without him, subsequent generations of possessed wordbearers struggled more with maintaining their identities, becoming more monster than man. Lorgar's decision to tell Kharn about Erebus's betrayal raised questions about the Urizen's true feelings about his first chaplain. Did the Primarch deliberately set up Erebus for that beating? Was this his way of punishing the first chaplain for overreaching, for killing one of Lorgar's favored sons without permission? Or was he simply being honest with Kharn, letting events unfold naturally? These questions remain debated among law scholars to this day. The fight also demonstrated something important about the World Eaters' culture and their fighting pits. These weren't just crude barbarism or senseless violence. They were a structured system for resolving disputes, for providing outlets for aggression that might otherwise tear the Legion apart. The pits had rules, traditions, respected boundaries. And those traditions allowed Kharn to deliver justice in a way that both legions could accept, even if they didn't entirely approve. Conclusion: justice, brutal and pure. In the grimdark future of Warhammer 40,000, where hope is the first casualty and heroes become monsters, moments of genuine satisfaction are vanishingly rare. The universe doesn't reward virtue, doesn't punish vice, doesn't care about fairness or justice or any of the comfortable lies we tell ourselves to make existence bearable. It simply grinds forward, crushing civilizations beneath its wheels, offering no meaning beyond what we create through violence and suffering. But sometimes, just sometimes, the stars align and someone who deserves punishment receives it, not through cosmic justice or divine intervention, but through the direct application of fists to face by a warrior who's had enough of someone's manipulation and schemes. When Kharn fought Erebus in that fighting pit aboard the Conqueror, when he beat the architect of the Horus Heresy so thoroughly that the first chaplain had to teleport away to save his own life, readers across the world experienced a moment of pure catharsis. This wasn't about celebrating violence for its own sake, though the scene was undeniably brutal. It was about acknowledging that sometimes the only way to deal with a manipulator is to bypass all their clever plans and simply hurt them until they stop being a problem. It was about the satisfaction of seeing consequences delivered to someone who had earned them through years of betrayal and manipulation. It was about justice, delivered in the most direct and unambiguous way possible. The scene worked because Aaron Dembski-Bowden understood what readers needed at that moment in the story. He'd spent books building up Erebus as this untouchable schemer, this manipulator who always escaped consequences through cleverness and preparation. He'd made readers hate the first chaplain with a passion that transcended normal fictional antagonism. And then he gave them Kharn, a grief-maddened warrior with nothing to lose, and let nature take its brutal course. What resulted was one of the most celebrated moments in the entire Warhammer 40,000 setting. A scene that has been discussed, analyzed, referenced, memed, and celebrated for years since its publication. A moment that perfectly captured the tension between manipulation and direct action, between cleverness and strength, between planning and just walking up to your problem and punching it repeatedly. The fight also served as a reminder of who Kharn was before he became the betrayer, before 10,000 years of endless slaughter reduced him to a champion of Khorne with no purpose beyond killing. He was a warrior who understood friendship, who fought for something beyond just the joy of violence, who could channel his rage into serving justice rather than simply feeding it blood. That version of Kharn died not long after Erebus teleported away, consumed by the very fury he'd used to deliver that beating. But for one moment, one perfect moment in a universe that offers precious few of them, Kharn was exactly what he needed to be. A vehicle for justice. An instrument through which readers could experience the satisfaction of watching a villain finally get what they deserved. And everyone, from the fictional crowd watching in the pit to the real-world readers turning the pages, cheered. So if you've enjoyed this deep dive into one of Warhammer 40,000's most satisfying moments, if you appreciate stories where manipulators face consequences and justice gets delivered through fists rather than plans, then please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There are countless more stories in the grim darkness of the far future, tales of heroism and betrayal, of sacrifice and corruption, of warriors who fought for what they believed in even as the galaxy crumbled around them. And maybe, just maybe, we'll find more moments where someone who absolutely deserved a beating finally received one. More scenes where direct action trumped clever schemes. More instances of that pure, primal satisfaction that comes from watching fictional justice delivered in the most unambiguous possible way. Until then, remember, sometimes the solution to a manipulator isn't out-manipulating them. Sometimes you just need to challenge them to single combat in a fighting pit and beat them until they teleport away in shame. Kharn understood this. The fandom understood this. And Erebus, broken and bleeding and forced to flee, definitely understood this. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But occasionally, just occasionally, there's also justice.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.